Why are the people who use AI the most burning out the fastest? Because that's what a Harvard Business Review study found last month. Researchers from UC Berkeley spent 8 months inside a 200-person tech company. They ran 40 plus interviewed, tracked what happened when people were given AI subscriptions and told to get on with it. And the result was more burnout, not less. More. And look, I'm going to be straight with you. That study undermines the whole premise of my business. I set up Agent Flow, an AI tech consultancy, because I genuinely believe that AI can reduce the judgery that's stopping people from getting into flow and stopping them from burning out. So if the data says I'm wrong, what the hell is going on? In this video, I'm going to give you my hypothesis via a factory in New York in 1882, because it turns out, in my opinion, we've been here before. We've had this exact conversation almost word for word, just with different technology. And as always, there is a solution. It's just this one we might not like very much. Let me start with what the study actually found, because it's more nuanced than that headline. The 200 people in this company weren't forced to use AI. Their employer gave them subscriptions to various tools and left them to it. So the people using AI heavily were the enthusiastic adopters, the believers, the people who thought this technology was going to make their working lives better. And it did make them better. It made them more productive. They were doing more work, finishing tasks faster, taking on projects they'd been putting off for months. All of which sounds great until you notice that 62% of them, remember, these are the enthusiastic adopters, reported feeling burnout. Compare that to 30% of the C-suite who were using it significantly less. Researchers identified 3 mechanisms behind this. Task expansion. People were doing more work, not just the same amount of work, but faster. 2, blurred boundaries. The working day was getting longer because the tools made it easy to just keep going. And 3, increased multitasking, switching between more projects, more contexts, and more demands. So here's the paradox. AI is making people more productive and more burnt out simultaneously. And that doesn't make sense. Unless you start to think about what kind of work people are actually doing more of. Because here's the thing. When I speak to businesses, and I speak to a lot of them because I run an AI consultancy, the conversation rarely starts with, we know exactly what we want to automate. It's usually more like, we've got a load of tedious, repetitive tasks that are burning our people out and stopping them from doing the good stuff. Can you come and have a look and help us figure out what to do? So we do. Like any good consultant, we go in and we ask people what their job spec says they do, and then we break down what they actually do into workflows. Then we break those workflows down into tasks. And we look at those as to things that can be automated, things that can't. And when they can't, it's usually because they need human judgment or a decision or whatever it happens to be. And then we play all of that back to them. And time again, people scratch their heads and they go, is that all I do? Then we ask what else they do. And that's when it gets interesting. Because what we find consistently across every type of business we work with is entirely backed up by Asana's Anatomy of Work Index, a study of over 10,000 knowledge workers run across multiple years. And what that found is exactly what we find, is that 60% of the average working day isn't the actual work. It's not the stuff you find on a job spec. It's coordination. Status updates, chasing approvals, searching for information, sitting in meetings about meetings. Only 27% of the day is spent on the skilled work people were actually hired to do. So the stuff that we break down into workflows and tasks. This phenomenon, it turns out, has a name. It's called the coordination tax. And what it really is a huge set of tasks that people do every day that have nothing to do with the job they signed up for, and which constrain them from ever really doing it. That's the problem. And the great thing is, we've been here before. To understand why, I need to take you back to 1882. Edison builds the first electricity generating station. Pearl Street, New York. And over the next couple of decades, factories start electrifying. Steam engines come out, electric motors go in, and everyone's very excited because this is transformative technology. Everyone knows it's going to change everything, except it doesn't, not for a very long time. For 20 to 30 years after electrification began, the productivity gains were basically zero. The economist Paul David documented this. He said productivity growth was crawling around 1% a year. And then, right around the time Henry Ford opened that assembly line, it jumped to just over 3%, a number that sounds modest until you realise that sustained over decades, that gap compounds into an entirely different world. He wrote about it specifically because he could see the same thing happening with computers in the 90s. Transformative technology as it was, but no productivity gains. Why, he asked. The answer, it turns out, is breathtakingly simple. When factories first electrified, they just swapped the steam engine for an electric motor. And that's it. Same factory, same layout, same everything, just a different power source. Now, to understand why this is a problem, you need to know how factories actually worked before electricity. So, in the basement of every factory sat a huge steam engine, and that steam engine powered a single rotating shaft that ran the length of the building. I'm going to call it the crankshaft. From that crankshaft came enormous leather belts, one to each machine in the factory floor. That's how everything worked. But this came with constraints, and I mean constraints everywhere. Every machine could only run as fast as the crankshaft. They all had to go at the same pace, which in practice meant every machine ran at the speed of the slowest one. You could only have as many machines as the crankshaft could power, and as many as there was space to add the leather belts. So the number of workers you could have was fixed. If a rush order came in and you wanted to run some machines overnight, you couldn't just switch on the ones you needed. You had to fire up the entire factory. Every machine running, burning fuel and money, whether you needed it or not. And the leather belts themselves, enormously heavy, under constant tension. And when they snapped, which they didn't just stop, they took your arm with them. Accidents were everywhere and significantly commonplace. And then there was the most fundamental constraint of all. You had to design the entire factory around that power source, around that crankshaft. Every machine had to be close enough to the crankshaft for a belt to reach it, which meant you couldn't arrange things in the order that made most sense for actually building the product. You arranged them around the shaft, the flow of power, not the flow of work. None of this was seen as a problem. It was just what it meant to run a factory. So when the electric motors arrived, what did the factory owners do? They took out the steam engine, they put in an electric motor, and they drove the same crankshaft, same leather belts, same layout, same everything, just a different power source, which meant the electric motor made the machines run a bit faster. But because the whole system was still designed around that constraints of steam power, and it just meant the crankshaft broke down less often. The constraint hadn't been removed in any way whatsoever. It had just been asked to go a bit quicker. Now, Henry Ford had electricity in his home, and he noticed something about it, that each appliance could be powered independently. Duh. You didn't need one giant motor in the basement driving everything through a series of belts. You could just plug each thing in directly, its own power source. On when you needed it, off when you didn't. So Ford did something simple. He got rid of the crankshaft and the leather belts and gave each machine in his factory its own individual electric motor. And that solved the breakdown problem. No more crankshaft running hot, no more belts taking people's arms off. But here's the thing. Ford had only seen the crankshaft as a problem because it kept breaking and it was dangerous. He hadn't seen it as a constraint on the entire shape of the factory. So he rebuilt his factory with individual electric motors on every machine in exactly the same layout as before. The machines were still arranged around where the crankshaft used to be. The flow of work was still wrong. He had done the hard bit. He had found the cause of the breakdowns and fixed it. He just hadn't realised that removing the crankshaft had also, quietly, removed a set of constraints he had never even seen. It took a dude called William Parr Clarn to see it completely differently. Now, Clarn was head of the engine department at Ford, and in 1906 he visited a slaughterhouse in Chicago, Swift & Company, and he watched what they called the disassembly line. carcasses moving around an overhead conveyor, past a series of workers, each one doing a single task, one person removing one piece over and over and over. The efficiency of it stopped him cold, and he went back to Ford and he said, if they can kill pigs and cows that way, we can build cars that way. Weird, but true. The machines were no longer arranged around the flow of power. They were arranged around the flow of materials. Like, we know this. We understand how this works. The workers stay still. The work came to them. And when their first proper moving assembly line opened at Highland Park in 1913, what had taken 12 and a half man-hours to produce took 1 hour and 33 minutes. 3 things were required to get there. First, you had to recognize all the constraints in your business, not just the obvious ones, but the invisible ones, which by definition, they're invisible, is hard to do. Second, you had to understand what was actually causing them. And third, you had to have the imagination to see what was possible once they were gone. Now, look, you can see where I'm going with this. The parallel between how businesses implemented electricity in factories and how they're implementing AI today is pretty obvious and actually pretty well documented. And based on what we now understand about the coordination tax, we can understand what the modern day constraints are in the 21st century white-collar office environment. It's all those meetings about the work, the status updates, the chasing approvals, the work about work, the tasks that aren't in the job description you signed up for and aren't technically getting paid to do. But here's what took me longer to figure out. What's causing those constraints? What's the office crankshaft? Because it's not laziness. It's not bad management. It's not people being political or inefficient. It's the inevitable consequence of a biological limitations that we all share, us humans. Thing is, we don't have a hive mind. There's no magic telepathy between us all. And if your work involves any sort of collaboration between humans, that's a problem. That's the crankshaft that causes all the constraints. Think about what that actually means in practice. When I was CEO of media at Dentsu and I wanted to go and see a media owner, for those of you outside the industry, that's essentially a supplier. I'd speak to my head of investment, which was the team that looked after those partnerships, and I'd say, I'm going to see supplier X in a couple of weeks. What's the state of the relationship? What do I need to know? All the classic questions. Just trying to have a better meeting, really. They would go and ask their person, who would go and ask their person, the person who actually managed that relationship day to day, and that person would spend time putting together what they thought I needed, which, by the way, involved a huge amount of manual data pulling, scrubbing, cleaning, and analysis. And then it would come back up the chain, getting filtered and summarized at each level until I got something. And guess what would happen when I got it? I always had more questions. Those questions would go all the way back down and all the way back up. And of course, sometimes I'd think this is madness, so I'd short circuit it all and go straight to the relationship manager. But then the people in the middle would get annoyed that I'd cut them out, which is completely understandable. That's just how humans in business seem to work. None of that was anyone's job, right? My job was to have a brilliant, productive meeting with the media owner at a C level to help ensure that things were moving in the right direction, profitably and productively for both parties. Everything around that was just coordination tax. Tax that exists because the organization and the people in it can't just know things. So someone has to ask, someone has to compile, someone has to verify, someone has to present, and everyone hates doing it. And here's the thing that I think is most important about all of this. The coordination tax is not visible on any dashboard. Nobody measures it. Not one board report in the history of board reports has a line for percentage of the week spent on work about work. We can tell you all sorts of details about cost, revenue per head, margin on this project and that project. We cannot tell you how much of everyone's week went on chasing people for updates and sitting in alignment calls. And I wonder if that's because the people who had commissioned that measurement, the C-suite who have experienced this throughout their entire careers, don't want to admit it. Because at the end of the day, the people who generate the most coordination tax are the C-suite, I think. I include myself in this. When I was in big leadership roles, every question I asked cascaded. Every request for an update triggered a chain of reaction below me that consumed far more time than I ever spent asking. The more senior you are, the higher the rate of tax you charge the organization. And the more junior you are, the more of it you pay. When I left Dentsu, my boss very reasonably asked me for a handover note. And I spent a long time trying to work out what to write in that note. In the end, I gave her our strategy document and the latest status update. Now, she wasn't particularly happy about that. And I understand why. Her question was, what do you actually do? And I sat with that question for a while because the honest answer was, for the vast majority of my working day, I made sure that document I gave her got delivered. The bit I loved, the strategy, the vision, galvanizing the team around a direction, that was maybe the first 3 months of the year. After that, my job was just coordination, sitting in meetings, chasing people, putting my arm around people, unblocking things, making decisions between competing priorities with incomplete information. How do you put any of that on a handover note? And that was the moment I realized most of what I did every day was a tax on the people below me. That's the crankshaft, the constraint that nobody sees because it's just how work works. It's baked into the org chart, it's baked into job titles, it's baked into the way meetings get called and decks get made. Nobody put it there on purpose, nobody designed it, it just accumulated. And the fact that it's never appeared on a P&L, never shown up in an operational due diligence report, never once had a line in a board paper, well, that's not because it doesn't cost anything. It's because it's invisible. And invisible things don't get fixed. Look at your own job. I bet there's a version of this in there somewhere. Maybe you're the one generating it. Maybe you're the one paying it. Probably both. That's the crankshaft, the constraint nobody sees because it's just how work works. So what happens when you introduce AI into this system? Well, what the HBR study shows is exactly what happened in those factories after electrification. You've replaced the steam engine with an electric motor. The work gets done faster. The machine runs quicker. But the crankshaft is still there. We still don't have a hive mind. Humans still can't just know things. And so all the constraints that generates are still there too. The status updates, the alignment meetings, the chasing, the briefing, the 60% that isn't the job. So the people who are using AI are doing more actual work in the time that they manage to recover from their tasks, and they're still paying the full coordination tax on top of it. 2 kinds of exhaustion for the price of one. And here's the thing that makes it slightly more complicated. Before AI, that 40%, the skilled work you were hired to do, wasn't all high intensity, it was a mix. You had moments of deep, difficult thinking, but you also had shallow, skilled bits. Formatting a deck, cleaning up a spreadsheet, drafting a basic email, those were low cognitive demand tasks. In a perverse way, they were your mental rest stops, moments where your brain could idle while you were still being productive. But AI is incredible at those exact shallow tasks. So when you use AI for the 40%, it doesn't take away the hard thinking. It takes away the easy stuff. It takes away the rest stops. Now your 40% is nothing but high intensity, cognitively demanding work. You're redlining your brain for 4 hours straight. And then, because we haven't fixed the crankshaft, you still have to go and pay the full 60% coordination tax. You're still chasing the approvals and sitting in status meetings. You've lost the recovery time within your actual job, but you've kept the frustration of the work about work. That is the recipe for the intensified burnout that the HBR study found. Which means the goal isn't just to do the 40% faster, it's to use AI to do what Ford did. Remove the structural constraint and then reimagine the system around what's possible without it. And here's where it gets really interesting, because unlike the crankshaft, which required a physical rebuild of the factory, the coordination tax has a very clean technical solution. AI agents don't have a coordination tax. They can be built to share information. They can have what is effectively a distributed memory, not a true hive mind, but something that functions like one for the purpose of organizational knowledge. Let me tell you how this works in practice, because I don't want this to be theoretical. My business partner Stephen and I run Agent Flow together, just the two of us. No admin. Very, very few status meetings, and when they are, they're short. Because what we do is we maintain a set of shared documents, project repos on GitHub, essentially, that our AI tools read at the beginning of every session. When something changes on a project, we update the repo. Now, my chief of staff agent, which I've called Jarvis, runs a daily report against those repos and gives me a summary every morning of where everything stands, what's changed, what I need to know, and so on. It takes me 10 minutes to read, And it means that Stephen and I almost never have to have a where are we on this conversation. The AI already knows. We just go straight to the decisions. That saved us what? An hour a day of coordination tasks? And we're only 2 people. Now, you might say, fine, but you are only 2 people. This doesn't scale. But actually, I think it does. If you're in a Microsoft 365 environment, Copilot can already do this. It can read your SharePoints. It can answer your questions about project status. You can go to it and say, what's the current state of our relationship with this client? And it can pull together an answer in seconds from across your entire shared document library without anyone having to write a brief, without anyone having to ask someone who then goes away and does a load of work. Now, it won't get everything. It'll miss nuance. There are things that a quick phone call or a 30-second message will always do better than a document. But I'd ask you to weigh what you lose against what you gain. Because right now, the alternative to a 2-page brief is also a 2-page brief, just written by a person who'd rather be doing something else. For the C-suite specifically, and I'm talking to you here because you are the biggest tax collectors in your organizations, the question is, how many of the questions you ask could be answered by an AI that has access to the right information, rather than by a cascade that goes down 4 layers, then comes back and gets filtered? You know what I'm describing. You can probably think of 3 examples from last week. You've already paid for the AI. It's in your Microsoft subscription. It's in your Google Workspace with Gemini. You don't need board approval for this. You don't need a change program or a CFO sign-off or a project team. What you need to do is to stop pointing this powerful AI you've got at just the 40%, at just the tasks and the workflows that people to do. Of course, you've got to help them do that because it does make people more productive. It does help people get more creative. But you've got to figure out how to start pointing it at that 60% of the coordination tax. Now, it's not quite as easy as it sounds, since you will need people to keep centralized records of where everything stands. But their AIs can do that for them too if you know what you're doing. Now, there's one more thing I need to address, because this is where the HBR study gets a little bit dark. The researchers found that when people got time back from AI, they didn't go home early, they didn't even take a break. Instead, they immediately reached into their backlog, that pile of important projects they'd been putting off, and pulled more work into their day. But here's why that led to more burnout, not less. Before AI, your skilled work, that 40%, was a mix of intensity. You had the hard, deep thinking stuff, but you also had your shallow tasks, the formatting, the data entry, the basic drafting of emails or documents. Those were your mental rest stops. They allowed your brain to idle while you were still being productive. AI is incredible at those shallow tasks. So when you point AI at your job, it doesn't take away the hard thinking, it takes away the easy stuff. It removes the rest stops. Now your 40% is nothing but high intensity cognitive load, that real mental effort. You're redlining your brain for 4 hours, and because we haven't removed the crankshaft, you're still forced to context switch back into that 60%, the work about work stuff. Your brain isn't just tired, it's frazzling. Context switching, that mental tax of jumping between a high stakes project and a meeting about a meeting, is physically exhausting for the human brain. The goal of solving the coordination tax isn't just to do more work, it's to create white space, unallocated time for recovery. The stuff that you used to get when you were just formatting a document. We need that space to go for a walk, have a coffee with someone, or just let our minds wander. That isn't laziness, that's decompression. And it's actually the only place where the big ideas and the serendipitous meetings of minds create the breakthroughs from. Because here's the truth, right? You cannot innovate when you are in survival mode. You cannot build the future of your business or your industry if 100% of your cognitive load is spent just trying to keep your head above water. Ford's breakthrough wasn't just a technical one, it was really a shift in where he pointed his resources. So by removing the wasted effort of the crankshaft, he made it possible to reimagine what a factory could actually be. Here's how the factory story ends. Ford didn't just build a faster car. He built the same car, the Model T, but so much faster and with so much less wasted effort that the price dropped from $825 to under $300 in 15 years, which meant that ordinary people, including the factory workers building the car, could afford to buy one, which created demand nobody imagined, which created industries nobody had imagined, new roads, new services, new kinds of jobs. The productivity gains from removing the crankshaft didn't just benefit Ford, they flowed into the whole economy. That's the pattern, and we're at the beginning of it again. You don't need to put the coordination tax on a spreadsheet. You don't need to measure it and present it to the board. The moment you start measuring it, it becomes a redundancy conversation. And that's not what this is about. This is quieter than that. This is just see it for the first time as the constraint it actually is, and then use the AI you've already got in your business to start dissolving that coordination tax. Some habits to change, a few processes to set up, no new investment required whatsoever. Point it at the 60%, not just at the 40%, because once you see the crankshaft, you can't unsee it. Now, if this landed for you, please subscribe. I'll be posting on AI, work, and the actual implications of this stuff as often as I can. And if you want to have a proper conversation about your specific situation, there's a link to book a call with me and Agent Flow in the description. So thanks for watching. As I said, please leave comments, please share, please like. Hopefully I'll see you again. Cheers.